Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another edition of our online children's lit class. I'm working from home, as you can see. Chelsea is busy running around. Um, she's in her manic mode right now. So I don't know if we'll get a chance to see her, if she'll stay still long enough for us to get a chance to see her or not. But hopefully she'll make an appearance, do a little cameo by the time we're done. I am recording this on Wednesday night, and I will post it obviously on Thursday. And by this point, most of the homeworks on Bridge to Terabithia have not been turned in yet, obviously. And so I think I'm going to hold off on our discussion and my lecture of Terabithia until Monday's lecture after all the responses have come in. And so we'll focus on the questions I ask you about Terabithia, and we will judge how realistic it is dealing with some of the issues that we see in the book. Obviously, the primary issue is the death of a loved one, of a close friend, and how realistically that is portrayed. So I'll get into that in much more detail on Monday, but I think I'll hold off on that until then. So I'm not going to talk about that today, but I do want to introduce realistic fiction as our next genre of literature. And by and large, I would say the kind of works that we would perceive as realistic fiction or not are probably works that are starting to be aimed at an older audience than maybe some of the other works we've been doing. Um, I think we're dealing with uh, tweens now, uh, children from the ages of 10 to 12 on the cusp of adolescence. And I mentioned, I think in another video, as kids get older, their reading preferences change sometimes, and they move away from simplistic stories and fantasy and comic books and fairy tales, and they become attached more to well, hopefully realistic works that deal with real issues and problems that they find themselves dealing with as they are getting older and as they are on the cusp of adolescence. And we're talking about, you know, fourth, fifth, sixth grade into middle school, seventh, eighth grade. Um, and, you know, we've all been there, we've all gone through it, we've all survived it. And middle school years can be very difficult. And so literature can reflect the kinds of issues and problems that older children are beginning to face at this stage in their lives. And I think Bridge to Terabithia is a good introduction to that kind of situation. I also think Wonder, which obviously is a much more recent work, does that to a certain extent as well. Um, so I want to talk a little bit about the main issues and concerns that we start to see in works aimed for slightly older audience of children, because as they get older, they become more aware of the world around them, and they broaden their experiences and uh, begin to take on new responsibilities. And with all of that responsibility and freedom, more freedoms, with all of that also comes the realization that maybe there aren't always happy endings in life, and maybe there are some aspects of their world that aren't so pleasant, and maybe can't just be blinked away. And um, it can be a very tough time. It's an adjustment for children moving into their tween years and into their adolescent years to the point where we could call them young adults. And then we can talk about them in my other class, my Lit for Young Adults class. So I want to talk about, you know, those basic themes and issues that we see. And then we'll talk about how the two works I've assigned to you maybe deal with some of these issues. And then hopefully you will also uh, be taking a look at on your own other works that deal with other issues that older children, let's call them the tween years or young adults, uh, begin to deal with. And how realistically do the works deal with these issues and problems that they're facing? So that's kind of what's on tap for today. Let me explain the homework first. And let me give you a second number here. How about 56? 56 will be our second number. Okay. All right, this is the homework for class 11. My gosh, it really has gone fast, hasn't it? We're coming up to the last few episodes here, are we? So this is the homework that's due by Sunday midnight for class 11. And I have a little picture. If you know, you know. Uh, It's kind of a reference to the character 11 from Stranger Things. Wonderful. Well, I don't know. I can't speak to the latest season. I have not seen the latest season, but the first couple were pretty good. And to me, she is the backbone of the story. Uh, my problem with the series tends to be whenever she's not on screen, I kind of lose interest because she's so good. And there were episodes where she was hardly in it. But anyway, that's the character 11 if you were wondering who that was or what that was all about. Okay, so obviously watch this lecture from Thursday, July 24th, and take note of the numbers in sequence like you always do and include those in your homework. All right, as I said, hopefully in the next couple of days, I will have the presentations that the students did in the fantasy science fiction presentation group. I will have those in Canvas, clearly labeled in a file. So I'd like you to read those over the weekend. Also, some corresponding pages in the packet, 171 to 186. And then I am going to ask you to get started reading Wonder. I mentioned the other day, I believe this is the longest book in terms of pages that I ask students to read in children's lit. I think most of the books I have you read, you could read in one sitting. I'm not sure you could read this in one sitting unless you like to sit for a long time. So I am going to give you a little bit of a break here. I'm going to break up the reading in sort of halves. So I'm going to ask you to read Wonder parts 1 through 4. And when you read the book, you'll see what I mean. The book is separated into parts. It's also interesting in that it's narrated by different characters. The main character, Augie, does narrate most of the chapters, but we also get a chapter narrated by his sister and by his sister's best friend and by his best friend. And so you get different perspectives. It's kind of interesting that way. So in my book, in my edition, that's to page 185. It may be different in your edition, but the parts are clearly indicated. So read through part 4. And obviously, if you want to go ahead and read the whole thing over the weekend, you can, but I'll ask you to read the rest of it for next Thursday. And there will be a writing assignment. There will be a homework assignment on Wonder specifically later next week after you've read the entire book. But I'm just going to ask you to break it up into halves. So read the first 4 parts for before class on Monday. And then there is a homework assignment that I'm going to ask you to do, and I'm going to explain it in a minute because it's also a good way to introduce the kinds of issues I was talking about a couple of minutes ago. And it's labeled the Realistic Precepts Assignment, and that will be worth 20 points. So that's what you will be turning into me by midnight on Sunday. We are getting to the end of the semester. We only have a couple weeks left. Um, I might also encourage you to be thinking about your final paper and maybe be working on topics for your final paper. And again, as I mentioned before, I'd be very happy to answer any questions you're having about topics or look over any kind of drafts you're coming up with, or if I can help in any way, work have if I can help you in any way as far as writing your draft of your paper, please let me know about that. So read some Wonder and then do this following assignment. And the reason I was kind of distracted there is that we do have, you see her? Oh, she just hit. Uh, thought we were going to have a Chelsea cameo, but we did not. All right, so that's the homework due by midnight on Sunday. Let me give you another number, 60, 60. All right, let me explain the homework, the precepts assignment, so-called. And oh, we do have a Chelsea cameo. There she is. That's the most recent picture I've taken of her. That was taken just last night. Um, one sad little note here. She's still very small. She's not even 4 months yet. But she is getting a little bigger day by day. And I rue the day, or I fear the day when she gets a little bit too big to rest comfortably on my lap. But so far, she has a special place right there. Um, but she's getting bigger. My little girl's is growing up, so I guess I can't stop that. All right, here is what I'm asking you to do. This will be the writing assignment. This will be the homework assignment for the weekend. As you read Wonder, one of the things you're going to notice is that one of his teachers, Mr. Brown, likes to give the students what he calls precepts, and he'll mention and he'll present any number of these in the course of the story, and it's kind of a clever way of also introducing some of the themes and lessons of the novel itself. Uh, so Mr. Brown will give out these precepts, and then, not coincidentally, we will see how many of them play out and are illustrated in the actions of the characters throughout the story. I love this book, by the way. I'll just say that right now. I love the movie version too. Anyway, so precepts are basically epigraphs, words of wisdom, words of advice, uh, could be no longer than a sentence or two or three, some bit of advice. And the whole premise of this assignment is that all of you have survived your childhood years. You've all survived your tween years, and I'm guessing you've all survived your adolescence. Um, and you probably learned a lot through those experiences. And now here's your opportunity to impart your wisdom to kids who are about to go through that themselves. All right. And this is the age group we're dealing with in the Bridge of Terabithia. Also, these are the ages of the kids in Wonder. They're in the tween years. You know, they're no longer little kids anymore, but they're not young adults, although the pressures on them to grow up might be very tough. So basically, it's kind of a fun assignment, but I think it's also in keeping with how Wonder is structured. I'm going to ask you, as it says here, based on your experiences as survivors of childhood and adolescence, what are five or more, and if you want to give me more than five for extra credit, you can, but list at least five epigraphs. He calls them precepts. I would call them words of wisdom, bits of advice that you would give to children today, particularly those tweens that are about ready to or are in the midst of going through those very difficult years we know as the tween years or the pre-adolescent years. We're talking maybe from fifth, sixth grade, middle school. I know um, when I say middle school, depending on where you went to school, that could be fourth grade, fifth grade, sixth grade, seventh grade, eighth grade. Um, I remember when I went to middle school, well, we called it junior high. It was grades 7, 8, and 9. But I know now middle schools, often middle schools are started as early as the fourth grade or fifth grade. Uh, so whatever your experience was, but this is the age group we're talking about. And of course, I was going to say sadly, uh, it's probably true that kids today grow up much faster and mature much faster and have to much more so than certainly my generation and maybe even your generation. That's how fast these things happen. But anyway, you are experts. You've gone through it, so you have a chance to impart what you've learned going through and surviving these years. So, what would be some of your precepts, things that might help them navigate those very difficult years that we're talking about? So give 5 precepts or words of advice or words of wisdom. And then, if you can, for each one, is there a work that you can think of? And by work, obviously, again, I mean a book, movie, TV show, whatever, that kind of helps shows that precept that you've come up with. Maybe helps illustrate that theme or helps show uh, a character going through that particular issue or problem in a realistic, believable way. Um, so they can be about anything, anything that you have learned, any words of wisdom, any piece of advice. So if a 12-year-old, 13-year-old kid were to come up to you, and maybe you have this experience, maybe you have younger siblings or nieces and nephews, or I know, a couple of you have kids of your own, and maybe they're entering this stage, and they come up to you and they say, you've been through this. Do you have any advice to me? I'm about ready to, in the fall, I'm about ready to start middle school. Oh my God, middle school. Do you have any advice for me? Um, Here's your chance to impart your words, your words of wisdom. And then I will compile these. These usually come out really, really good. And some of them can be very, very serious. Some of them are kind of on a humorous note. But uh, again, that's the premise of the assignment. So Mr. Brown in the book Wonder presents a number of precepts to his children, his students, uh, and here's your chance to offer your own. Okay. Um, There he is. Hey, Chelsea girl. Hey, baby girl. You just hanging now? You just chilling? Like I said in a previous video, uh, when I first got her, she had 2 speeds. You know, one was manic crazy and the other one was just zonked out sleepy. But now there's a third speed, and I like this speed. It's like, yeah, I'm here. I'm not asleep. I'm just kind of hanging with you, Shank, and listening to your brilliant lecture. And she hasn't fallen asleep yet, so that's promising. Okay. All right. Anyway, now I said in lieu of going over criteria for judging realistic fiction, instead I would focus on talking about some general themes and current issues that children, once they're of a certain age, they have to start dealing with these things. They won't be sheltered from them, maybe as they were as children, or maybe until they were a certain age, they didn't really understand the gravity of the issues or didn't understand what was going on. But as I said, as they get older and they're more self-aware and they're more aware of the world around them, Um, they begin to see, among other things, that uh, the boogeyman, I always use this analogy, the boogeyman uh, in their closet or under their bed doesn't exist, but there are, real life boogeymen out there um, that they have to deal with and understand. All right, so as kind of a way to help you with the prompt, because if you're wondering about, well, what kind of I don't know what kind of advice he's looking for. They can be general pieces of advice for a tween, somebody about ready to enter middle school, or you might direct your precepts to particular issues um, that you yourself had to deal with during this time. And again, it might be helpful to also include works that included a character going through this particular theme or issue. Um, and that includes, you know, relationships with peers, peer pressure, um, peer pressure, uh, the, the approval of our peers is always important in all stages of our life, but I can't think of a time in our life where peers are more important than, say, the middle school or the early adolescent years. It's so important to be liked and have friends and to fit in. And sometimes, for whatever reason or reasons, you don't, or a character doesn't fit in. I think we see that in Terabithia. I'll talk more about this on Monday. But we have basically two outcasts in the story who find each other and bond with each other and become each other's best friends. And it's really that's a beautiful aspect of the story. You know, both Jess and Leslie, just don't really fit in, uh, but they find comfort in each other. Um, so, uh, what advice might you give somebody in regards to peers or peer pressure? And are there any good works that deal with this issue? Family relationships get a little bit maybe more complicated as children get older. And, um, you know, when you're a 6-year-old and your parents tell you to do something, you do it because their mom, their dad. But when you get to be 10, 11, 12, 13, maybe you begin to see that your parents are not godlike creatures who can do no wrong. And, things start to get a little bit more complicated there. Um, Obviously, this begins a time in one's life where temptations such as alcohol and drugs um, come into play. Usually, if we had time in a class discussion, I usually ask a little poll question. When's the first time you ever smoked a cigarette? How old were you when you had your first taste of alcohol? Um, how readily available were drugs in your school? Those kind of questions, because these are kind of real life issues that young adults have to navigate. And are there good works, effective, realistic works that deal with these issues uh, believably and realistically? Um, some young people might have special needs that are recognized by this point in their lives. And are there works that show this effectively and realistically? Or if you're not a young person, or you weren't a young person with special needs, perhaps your world then opened up and included uh, children with special needs. And again, are there works that deal with that issue? Um, Certainly, they're more susceptible and maybe have to deal with issues such as violence and abuse, God forbid. But maybe that's a part of their everyday lives, depending on where they live and what their family situation is and what their social economic situation is. And maybe again, as I go through these, you might think to yourself, yes, I had to deal with some of these issues and I got through it. I survived. What would be my word of advice or my piece of advice in dealing with things of this nature? Um, race and class becomes and the differences in those become very evident as you get older. I mean, you throw a bunch of, 5, 6 year olds together in a room. They're not going to care how much money their parents make or, you know, whether they're wearing the nicest clothes or not, or what neighborhood they live in. But these are the kinds of things that, again, as a child gets older, becomes more and more aware of that. And what happens if you find yourself maybe in a lower class. Maybe your parents don't make as much money as your friends, or maybe you live in a poor neighborhood, or maybe you can't afford the latest styles. And all of these things can help ostracize you or make you an outcast in a way that you never had to worry about when you were a little kid. Other things, obviously, at some point, and we're talking about puberty now, puberty hits us all around this time, and this can be a very complicated and traumatic time in one's life, particularly for girls and their first period, etc. And of course, the classic text in that issue is Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret. I'm sure many of you have read that book. And, uh, it's the first signs that you are becoming, you're no longer a child, but you are an adult. And do you have any advice on that? Um, Also, this is the time when we become aware of our sexuality and um, our sexual orientation. And this is the time when we realize, hey, I have sexual feelings for um, people of the opposite sex, or I realize I have sexual feelings for people of the same sex, or I have feelings for both sexes. I mean, this is usually the time where those realizations start to occur. And are there good works that deal with this particular issue? And do you have some advice on navigating that very important but sometimes difficult time in our lives? Um, Other things such as bullying. We have a bully in the Bridge of Terabithia, and I think that issue and that situation is handled in a kind of an interesting way. Janice Avery is the bully in the story, but not a totally indefensible, evil character. We see another side, and we learn something about bullies in that story. We have a bully in Wonder too. I won't give too much away, but we have a bully character in Wonder too, and we'll see how that plays out. So if you were bullied as a kid, do you have any advice on how to navigate that, how to deal with that? Uh, Also, appearance begins to become very important uh, during this time period. How you look, how attractive you are, how thin you are, how fat you are, how tall, how short, how developed you are. All of these things help complicate and sometimes make life very difficult for the tween, the pre-adolescent. Um, Sadly, uh, this becomes a time when children become of an age where a lot of these issues that I have listed here maybe become too much to bear, and this is maybe their first time actually contemplating uh, ending their own lives and maybe even attempting it or carrying it out. Uh, Very sad, but of course, studies have shown that we have suicide attempts at earlier and earlier ages today. And usually in my Lit for Young Adults class, there is a book we dealing with suicide, 13 Reasons Why. And usually in that class, we have a discussion, and I ask the students, did any of you have a classmate, a peer, who either attempted suicide or successfully uh, did kill themselves? And then what was the reaction and how was it handled in the school? And were there counselors involved? And just general questions like that, because this is a very real, this is a reality for today's kids, sadly. I've mentioned puberty already. Um, A new pressure that's just been relatively newly introduced in society is, of course, the internet and all the wonderful things that it can provide for the young generation today. But then also it's strewn with hazards and there's a lot of bad stuff about the internet and social media. Uh, I would imagine you guys I'm talking to are maybe the first generation who grew up with social media. Um, and it can be a wonderful thing. It could be a wonderful way of gaining information and interacting with people, but it can also be very hurtful and very harmful. And do you have any, if you were a victim of that growing up as a young person. Do you have any advice for somebody on how to deal with that? And a few more. I mean, these are all things that kids have to deal with. Clicks, dealing with clicks. And, clicks have kind of gotten a bad rap. We tend to, when we say that word, we tend to think of it in negative terms. All it really means is that it's a natural progression, it seems to me. Um, After you get to be a certain age, you start to develop certain interests and hobbies, and you tend to gravitate toward those people who share your interests and hobbies, etc. It doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing, but it can be a bad thing when you find yourself not in a clique, not fitting in anywhere. And do you have any advice for people in that situation? And are there any books, movies, TV shows that realistically portray that dilemma? Let me give you another number, 63. 63. Um, Something as, well, I shouldn't say as simple as moving can be a very traumatic and devastating thing for a pre-adolescent to go through. I mean, if your family moves when you're 4 or 5, it's probably not going to disrupt your life too much. But if your dad comes home one day when you're 12 and says, "I got a job halfway across the country, we're moving, so you're going to have to start sixth grade in a totally different town and state and make all new friends," I mean, that can be very, very difficult. Have you ever gone through that? uh, and maybe you have advice for young people who have to be the new kid in school. After building relationships and losing all your old friends, suddenly you know nobody and nobody knows you, and you're in a totally foreign situation. Um, are there works that realistically portray that situation? And do you have advice for somebody going through that if you have gone through that? Sibling relationships can become more complicated as you get older, and maybe you've experienced that. Also, another serious issue that takes place sometimes in a young person's life. And again, the older I think a child is, the more they might be. Well, I don't know. I was going to say the more devastated they might be, but that's probably not true. I think a small child can be devastated by the divorce of their parents. I guess what I mean by that is the older you get, the more you're aware of perhaps the issues involved and understand what's going on more and what the reasons are for your parents divorcing. Um, and again, if you are a child of divorce, uh, are there any bits of advice that you might give a child who is going through that as they approach their adolescent years? I'm a child of divorce, but my parents didn't divorce until I was a freshman in college. So, by that time, it was still devastating, obviously, but I was old enough and mature enough to be able to handle it much better than I would have handled it 4, 5, 6 years prior. And then finally, we read about this in a fantastical way in Charlotte's Web, and we learned the nice little lesson that, death is a part of life and the spider dies and we shed a tear, but it's all fantasy and it deals with animals. But, sadly, a child probably experiences for the first time somebody close to them dying. And at some point, they're old enough to understand uh, the implications of that. And it can be a very difficult thing to get through, especially if it was somebody very close to you. a family member, or as we see in Terabithia, a friend, somebody who's become very important to us as a friend. Um, and these are the kinds of issues, uh, general themes that we see in works that are geared toward a slightly older audience. And if they're going to deal with serious issues like this, it's imperative that they do so in a realistic and believable way. Otherwise, they lose credibility and actually could be harmful if they misrepresent some of these issues. And maybe you've encountered works that have not done a good job handling some of these issues. You might jot those down as kind of a sidebar too, because I think we learn from the mistakes as much as we learn from the strong examples. You can't see him. She's looking out the window. All right. So that is, well, I've kind of killed two birds with one stone. I've explained the assignment I want you to do for Sunday night. And I've also gone over these general issues and themes that uh, well, we're gonna see some of them in the two books that I'm assigning to you. I'm sure the presenters who are in the realistic or historical fiction group will also present works that deal with some of these issues. And I'll just be very curious to see what your precepts are like and what your words of wisdom are, because again, you've all survived this. For some of you, it might just be looking back over maybe just a few years ago. In fact, I taught this class in the spring, and I had a student who was it was like a junior in high school. Um, and she was, taking college classes for credit and getting a head start on her college career. And she wasn't even, I think she was like 16 or whatever. Um, so it was kind of interesting to get her perspective because she was living it. And of course, I also had to watch my language during class, and I had to. Uh, but anyway, she was a very sweet kid, very bright kid. But sometimes I would defer to her. I'd say, "Okay, what's going on in your school, and what's happening in 10th grade?" And she would give us her insight because she was an expert. She was a current expert. But anyway, that's the assignment. As I mentioned, I'm letting you go a little bit early today. Hope you appreciate it. And you can thank me later. Say nice things to me on rate my prof or whatever. And I guess that's it. So until next time, uh, thank you all again very much.